Many say it sounds like something out of the blockbuster film The Shawshank Redemption. Two convicted killers apparently charm a prison worker who is now under arrest. In their bold bid to win their freedom, they used power tools to cut through the bars, drew through the walls, and tunneled their way out of a maximum security facility in upstate New York. I am joined now by the Fresh Outlook think tank. Alain Sanders, political science professor at St. Peter's University and dapper man about town. I'm also joined by Yohuru Williams, also a dapper man about town. He is a vice president of academic affairs at Fairfield University. And Kevin Calogero. He is the man who helps keep that thin blue line established between order and disorder. And he is a former member of the NYPD, New York City's finest. Joining us via Skype also is Doug Noll, an international award-winning author and expert on prison issues and reform in prison as well. Doug, I'm going to begin with you since you were up in the Monitor. What's your take on these two guys getting out of jail? It does seem like something out of a movie. It seems like it's implausible, right?
Well, it is kind of unbelievable that they would be able to break out. It sounds to me like there was just a massive security breakdown in the prison to allow this to happen. And the other thing is that I'm surprised that only one wall separated the prison cell they were in from the maintenance hatchway and then into the steam pipe. In level 4 maximum security prisons, at least in California, there is no way that would ever happen. There are so many barriers between a cell wall and the outside world that it's designed the prisons are designed to account for human error. And maybe this is an old prison, I just don't know. But obviously, if you can cut through a metal wall and get to a maintenance hatchway, you've got lots of problems. So it sounds to me like fundamentally there was a fundamental problem in the system to begin with.
Kevin, people are thinking that these folks are just within a few miles of the prison still. That's not my guess. My guess is anybody who planned and carried out an elaborate plan such as this is somewhere else, somewhere safe. Maybe even in China. They left a note that said, have a good day. And it seemed like they were digging a deep hole to China at that point. What's your take? Do you think the cops are right? Are they just hanging out in the woods near the prison?
I don't think they got that far. And the reason I say that is I think they were anticipating having somebody outside waiting for them to take them wherever they had to go.
But what about just like pulling over a car, commandeering it, killing the person, throwing them in the woods, taking their car?
It's a possibility, but that hasn't happened as of yet that we know of. I'm afraid that with more time, the more desperate they get, that those might be the following incidents that happen. So I'm hoping that they'll be able to catch these guys before that happens. A maximum security prison, this prison is older. I believe the ones in California are much newer, so I believe that also contributes to some of the problem. And security is two-sided. You know, the people that are locked up and the people that keep them locked up. So if the people that keep them locked in aren't doing their job for some reason, or you have somebody who, you know, was befriending them as this young lady was that was arrested, then, you know, that's a breach in itself that way. It's not as much a reflection on the facility as the people that were involved in this.
Alan, did that part of the story strike you as odd, that these people had some kind of relationship behind those bars? This woman, Joyce Mitchell, who's now under arrest, apparently she was a tailor who worked up at the prison. Right. And these two murderers, apparently she had a relationship with both of them of some sorts.
No, it doesn't surprise me. When people come into close contact and close quarters in very confined settings, it's not unusual for people to start sympathizing with each other and to understand each other. We've seen that in the context of hostages. Very often hostages become able to sympathize and do sympathize with their hostage takers. And this is a similarly highly controlled environment, and it doesn't surprise me at all. What's interesting is we don't really know how they escape. I mean, you say they used power tools. I've heard people comment, no, that it was actually prison officials, people who collaborated with the prisoners, who would have cut through the metal pipes and so forth, because all that stuff makes noise, creates dust, creates all kinds of evidence, and it would be hard to imagine, according to some of the people that have been interviewed in and around the prison, that the prisoners themselves would be able to do that unnoticed. So I think there's a lot to learn, and from what we know, this young woman who was arrested is not not claimed by the authorities to have been the one that provided the power tools. She provided some other equipment, but not the power tools that would have been used to cut through the metal that was involved here. So there's a lot more to learn, and it's a fascinating story.
Yohuru, part of the problem, I think, is that these guys were on an honor block. They were allowed to use civilian clothing rather than a prison uniform. They were given extra privileges. They were in a less secure facility because of that. Is this simply a way of keeping chaos from breaking out in prison by giving some people perks and privileges, even though they've dismembered their boss?
Well, I go back to Kevin's point earlier, which is that we still have to recognize that prisoners are human beings. And what you want to do is create conditions, ideally, where if these people are eventually going to get out, they can come back into society and behave.
But these guys were never getting out.
They weren't.
Hopefully.
They weren't. But you also want to create conditions where there's incentive for people who are locked up to behave in ways that will encourage them to be civil, to follow the rules, so on and so forth. I think what's unfortunate about this case is that ultimately it may result in pulling back some of those privileges, which in some cases do keep prisons, keep the lid on violence in prisons, and do create incentives for prisoners to behave better.
Kevin, I know one way to keep them behind bars: kill them.
That's a very philosophical issue. We've been battling that, the death penalty for many, many years, and in some cases, I believe in it.
I mean, this guy apparently tortured his boss, put him in the trunk of a car, duct taped him, cut him up, and dispersed his body around town. I mean, if there's a case for capital punishment, I think it was Richard Matt is the one who should pay that price, but that's neither here nor there. But this is an argument for capital punishment because people like Dzhokhar Tsarnaev wouldn't have a chance of escaping if they were killed.
Very true.
Well, I'm not sure it's a case for capital punishment. I think if you take a look nationally, I don't think there are that many prison escapes. I mean, this is one of the most spectacular ones, and it's drawing media attention because of its spectacular aspects. I mean, escapes do occur, but I think if you take a look at the statistics, most prisoners who do escape are caught almost immediately, very short amount of time. This is what makes this unusual. So I think incarceration still holds as a valid concept. Doesn't necessarily, because these people escape doesn't mean that all of a sudden we should go to the death penalty. I'm not sure I follow the logic there.
Well, there is some logic there. Kevin sees that it depends on your political
exactly. There's two logics.
And it also depends on whether you have a connection. If you're connected in some way to this crime, those people being out on the street right now. In fact, I think he even threatened the cop who arrested him that I'm going to come and get you. So it is kind of scary. What are your thoughts as we have this conversation as it applies to the death penalty? Because some people like me will say this is why we should kill him.
I'm staunchly opposed to capital punishment. I think it presents its own set of problems. I think it's freakishly applied. The Supreme Court said as much when they originally created a moratorium on it back in the 1970s. It's been reinstated, obviously, but we don't kill all murderers. And if we can't create some kind of uniformity, then there's always going to be a disparity in the way that it is administered. So for me,
and mostly it's men who are killed.
Correct.
Mostly minority men who are killed.
Correct. And then, there are some cases where horrific crimes have gone, and this you're pointing to this one as an example of that, and other cases where, there are mitigating circumstances. If it can't be uniform, I think it's inherently undemocratic, and we should move away from it as a punishment. Having said that, in this particular case, the great fear for me that comes out of this is that we're looking at the prison system at a time when we're saying, look, we've got to reimagine and rethink prisons. I mean, this is a problem with warehousing human beings, and we're not just talking about violent offenders, but some of the folks who are in for minor offenses. We've got to kind of reimagine this. This woman's making $57,000 a year working in the metal shop there with these men. There's got to be some more productive way to think about redirecting that energy and maybe having those people contribute to society in a more fundamental way. I'm not talking about hardened murderers here, but I think that this is an opportunity to rethink prisons.
And we will. The political campaign is going to be a place where this is going to be discussed.
It's already becoming
because you've got Republicans and Democrats willing to discuss that. Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to Doug a little bit. Doug, you're joining us again on the conversation. We are shocked that these guys were able to get out now that 8 days or more have passed since they escaped. Do you think that the chances of finding them are diminishing?
Well, it's interesting. I agree with the gentleman who said that there must be some outside help, because generally when inmates escape, which is very rare, they're almost caught immediately. So these guys may not be anywhere in the area. They could be halfway across the country or out of the country by now. They weren't that far from the Canadian border. Who knows? We just don't know. It's all very interesting. I also want to say that that I agree that we need to reimagine our prisons. I work exclusively with lifers, training them to be peacemakers and mediators within the prison. And I have found in my work that the vast majority of inmates that I work with, even though they have committed heinous crimes, are capable of transforming their lives and really turning their lives from living life sentences to living lives of service within prison. It's really remarkable the transformation that can occur in human beings if they're given the opportunity. And I'm not advocating necessarily that people are released, but certainly I have personally witnessed the ability for people to rehabilitate themselves, and I think that we need to strike a better balance between retribution and rehabilitation, if for no other reason to save tax dollars. In California, we spend $13 billion a year on prisons and $9 billion a year on education. I mean, what sense does that make? And so I think that this is something that we really need to have a public conversation about.
Good idea. Thanks for your time, Doug. And I'm going to turn it to you, Kevin. What's your quick prediction as to where these guys might be? I know it's anybody's guess, but put on your magic hat, look in the crystal ball, tell me where you think. If you're as smart as these guys, you've been planning this for months and months, okay, your getaway driver wasn't there, but maybe you had a plan B or C.
I don't think they went to Canada. That's my own personal view. I think they'd be a little more out of place in Canada. I think there's money differences. There's access to other people that they wouldn't have. I think that they're probably still, in the Northeast probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alan, your guess?
Well, I think this was well planned, probably with outsiders, and I think it's often been shown that the most obvious place to hide is usually the hardest place to discover. So I would think, where would be the most obvious place?
I would say
think
go to
that
New
way.
York City.
New York,
I would
yeah.
be going down. I wouldn't take the New York State Thruway because of Easy Pass and all the cameras. I would take 9W down, avoid all tolls. I would separate from my comrade, and I would blend into New York City. I would probably try to pose as a homeless person or a person whose housing is at risk, as we like to say. What's your guess, Yohuru?
I think this is the reason why they were so hesitant to arrest this woman right away. They recognize that she has great evidentiary value in terms of at least alerting them to places that they talked about, perhaps sharing some of their vision. Ultimately, she'll be key in helping investigators think about where they might be headed, but I agree. I think they're going to be very close at this point. There are not a lot of ways for them to, not be noticed as they try to make their exit out of that area.
It's interesting. Yes.
I think people that are listening need to look at their photos, and I think they need to be vigilant in looking. And if you do see one of these gentlemen, stay away and call 911. Give them their location, and honestly, just be careful.
Alan, why do you think Governor Cuomo seems to be politicizing this? Do you think it really is an issue that somebody like him could run on?
Well, because he has two things to think about. First of all, he can capitalize on the popularity of this, but once this episode is over, a lot of questions will be asked about prison security, which have to do with his administration. So I think he's trying to be out front to both capitalize on the popularity, but perhaps to also get ahead of the curve so that if any criticism comes his way as a result of prison management, that he can get some momentum out of this. So he's got to think about it politically now, but also politically for the future.
Since he talks like this, I don't think he's very smart, but in this case, he sounds pretty smart. That's our governor.
He took a big hit on the Black Lives Matter and everything that happened with Staten Island. This is an opportunity for him to again appear tough on crime. So I think it's a great political move stroke on his part.
Let me give our final word to Doug, who is joining us via Skype. Doug, rehabilitation rather than retribution, that's hard for a lot of the victims' family members to stomach at times.
I understand, but something, justice is never served by punishment. And although that's kind of our basic societal norm, we find that human beings can be transformed. Not all of them, not every time, but they can be transformed. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily can be released, but it does mean that they can be transformed from people who have committed heinous acts and done huge injury to victims to being able to live lives that perhaps are more beneficial within prison walls. And that's kind of what I've experienced. I totally empathize with victims and their losses, but also keeping people understanding that they probably don't feel a sense of justice either by retribution. And most victims don't always feel that justice has been done simply by locking people up. It's a much deeper injury that occurs, especially in a murder or a homicide. And I think we just need to start thinking about how we can have victim-oriented justice such as restorative justice, that might be more effective for both victims and help us deal with the 5% of our population that engages in violence and crime. It's a difficult conversation because of safety concerns and justice concerns, but it's a conversation that I think is long overdue. And one of the things I'll say about, even though this event is very unusual and very spectacular and newsworthy, it does give us the opportunity to come into the media and talk about prisons and retribution and punishment, and really ask questions whether or not is this the only way for us to protect our community. And the answer might be yes, but I think it's certainly overdue for conversation. And that's why I think stuff like this can really be useful, and especially in a political season, of forcing people to really ask questions. Rather than saying being tough on crime, can we ask the question, how can we be smart on crime?
All right, Doug, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you joining us today. Doug Noll and the rest of the Ebru think tank, thank you for your time. We're going to be back with more topics to talk about after this, including the results are in from the Turkish election, and they don't look good for the incumbent president. More on that after this.